On China's east coast, the economies of prosperous cities like Shanghai and Guangzhou have been growing for decades. But in China's far west, there's a boom in construction of what journalists, former inmates, and the United States government call concentration camps. A vast and growing network of what the Chinese government refers to as vocational training centers are believed to hold between 1 and 3 million people, perhaps as much as a quarter of the Muslim population of Xinjiang province. Outside the camps, Xinjiang is described by its Uyghur residents as a police state, where the Chinese government subjects the population to round-the-clock surveillance. Many traditional practices have been outlawed, intended to impose Chinese cultural unity on a multicultural region. Xinjiang, a region the size of Alaska, is home to 23 million people, 45% of whom are Uyghurs, a people who identify closely with the culture of Central Asia. The remainder are mostly Han Chinese, the majority ethnic group of mainland China. At first, the Chinese government denied the existence of the camps.
The allegation that millions of Uyghur people were imprisoned in the re-education center is completely not true.
Confronted with overwhelming evidence from satellite photography, witness testimonies, and internal Communist Party documents, the Chinese government has been forced to acknowledge their existence.
The Chinese government has set up a vocational education and training centers. These programs are preventive counterterrorism measures.
Beijing now says the camps are necessary to counter Islamic terrorism and to quell a violent separatist movement, such as Uyghur riots back in 2009 that left 200 mostly Han Chinese dead, and a terror attack by the East Turkestan Islamic movement in the heart of Tiananmen Square that killed 5 people. Party officials describe the training centers as paths out of poverty, designed to teach basic skills like sewing and reading.
The Uyghurs are canaries in a coal mine. And this is a life and death situation for the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are facing an existential threat.
Nuri Turkel is an attorney and an activist.
I was born in the re-education camp at the height of the Cultural Revolution. And oddly enough, the history is repeating itself.
An American of Uyghur heritage, I sat down with Turkel to discuss what he considers the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world today. You have described the situation in Western China as the largest internment of an ethnic minority in history since World War II.
Right.
What is going on there, and how do we know about what's going on there?
So back in 2016, Chinese government identified this Chinese version of Adolf Eichmann by the name Chen Quanguo, who was ruling Tibet until late 2016. So they brought him into power in the Uyghurs' homeland and provided him all the tools and power and the resources that could provide a final solution to the Uyghur problem. So with that, he initiated through his local legislative body to formulate what's known as the de-extremification measure that sanctioned some of the most acceptable behaviors in the society, such as growing beard, adhering to Islamic diet.
That's illegal.
That become illegal. Interfering your children's love affairs with non-Uyghur individuals. So this paved the way for the construction of concentration camps. So this individual by the name Chen Quanguo has quoted in AFP that these camps need to be constructed to teach like school, manage like prison, and protect like a military, with the purposes of breaking Uyghurs' lineage, origin, and roots. So the Xi Jinping government have been waging this modern-day cultural genocide in ethnic-specific concentration camps in the last 2-3 years, according to Pentagon and the State Department. Anywhere between 2 to 3 million Uyghurs and other Turkic people have been locked up in these camps.
For many of these prisoners who are interned there, there's no trial for them. Is that correct?
This is a no-rights zone as perfectly described by the UN. No nothing, no access to lawyers, no access to courts. Most of these people have been taken to the camps for several things. One, past writing, past teaching, past expression of political views or social views, or travel history, philanthropist work, and the songs that they performed on the stage, maybe inadvertently promoting ethnic pride, family connection with overseas or foreign-based Uyghurs, such as myself. So those are the things can make you a target. How do they come up with the list of people should go to the jail? Artificial intelligence. The authorities subjected Uyghurs to mandatory biometric collection, DNA sampling. That helped the Chinese government to build large database, artificial intelligence database.
I want to get into some of that because that is really fascinating 21st century technology in order to surveil a very large population. But I first want to just clarify with you some of the more credible but shocking allegations about what goes on in these camps.
Yeah.
For example, torture.
Yes. The Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims being detained go through both psychological and physical torture. At least one of those survivors managed to come to the United States, have described some of the typical psychological and physical tortures. Poor hygiene, no dietary arrangement, even people sleeping in a crowded prison cell in turn. And also the most disturbing way of torturing these Uyghurs, one of some of the most jarring aspects of these prison camps, one is to forced renounce and denouncing the ethnic and religious background. So you have to denounce your religion, calling it evil and replacing all the love and affection to God with Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping thoughts. And also survivors, these female survivors, one based in Turkey, one based in the United States, who testified before the US Congress, told us that the Uyghur women have been given some sort of mysterious pills.
They forced us to take unknown pills and to drink some kind of white liquid. The pill caused us to lose consciousness and reduced our cognition level. The white liquid caused loss of menstruation in some women and extreme bleeding in others, and even death. I also experienced torture in a tiger chair the second time I was detained. I was taken to a special room and placed in a high chair. Bands held my arms and the legs in place and tightened when they pressed a button. The guards put a helmet on my shaved head. Each time I was electrocuted, my whole body would shake violently, and I could feel the pain in my veins. I thought I would rather die than go through this torture. I begged them to kill me.
Satellite imageries only shows the facilities, but we do not know what actually happens inside the camps other than the experience being described by some of the survivors or the victims of the detainees being taken to the camps.
Most shockingly, though, regarding those satellite imagery, is there have been what appears to be large crematoria built around them. Is that something you're aware of? Do we know that, or is that just a supposition?
When the terminology comes up, the concentration camp, for example, people reasonably ask, well, it's not really concentration camps yet, in the sense that the Nazi Germany set up because there's no gas chambers. We don't know. We don't know really what is happening and how it's happening inside the camps. It's the same thing. The world did not know what really happened in Auschwitz and Dachau until after the World War II, until 6 million Jews lost their lives. So it's hard to know what is really happening. So it would be useful for some journalists or governments or international body to go actually see these crematoria. Why would they build crematoria? And why would they post job advertisement? If it's not expanded, if it's not a large facilities all around these modern-day concentration camps that have been identified through technology. And another question, legitimate question, you take in people in such a large number, more than 10% of the Uyghur population have been gone into the camps. What on earth that we don't see anyone leaving? Why do we always hear somebody leaving as a dead person? What happened to the rest of the population? So Radio Free Asia reported this crematoria construction that disturbed many of us, that shows that there is some active, that it shows that something unthinkable is taking place. Recently, a British TV station, ITV, broadcast an interview. And in that interview, a Chinese security official who agreed to speak said that we locked up people under the false premises that they would need to be re-educated. And also, because of the people going insane, we need mental hospital to keep them. Otherwise, they will be causing a lot of criminal activities or committing criminal activities in the society.
Originally, China just simply denied the presence of these camps.
Right. So do we have to really wait until some bodily damage actually seen to act? Or are we going to act based on what do we already know? Based on what happened to people in the history when they were locked up in such large numbers based on their ethnicity and religion. So all the indicators and trajectory shows a disturbing image.
Yeah.
This is why we've been telling the world, telling various audience that the Uyghurs are canaries in a coal mine. And this is a life and death situation for the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are facing an existential threat. And no world leader, either in office or outside the government, no former or current heads of state have taken up the cause yet, which is very disturbing.
China has, of course, their own point of view on all this. They see the Uyghurs as an existential threat to the Chinese state, right? That's why that justifies their harsh crackdown from their point of view. They claim there is a secessionist movement. They claim there is a jihadi terrorist movement. To what extent does that exist in Western China?
Any type of violent incidents that has been cited in the newspapers and even in the Chinese publication predates 2015. And the concentration camps start being built in late 2016. Mm-hmm. So why would you do something that has already been under control? If somebody commit acts of terrorism in a reasonable societies, in a reasonable countries, you would have at least someone, if not a investigative journalist, a lawyer would have access to get to the bottom of what really happened. If this is about terrorism, let me highlight this. The Secretary of State for the United States would not come out and say, as he did about 10 days ago, the way that the Chinese government's treatment of the Uyghurs is a stain on the century.
To be fair, though, there is a secessionist movement among Uyghurs, is there not?
The Uyghurs have had two independent republics in the modern history. The first one is in 1933. The second one is in 1944. Both of them are named East Turkestan Republic. That the name East Turkestan is related to that modern Uyghur political history. So the second one was established with the help of the Soviets and also destroyed with the help of the Soviets 5 years later. Because of that glorious history that the Uyghurs are always nostalgic about, the Uyghurs' desire for an independent homeland has never disappeared. Even after the brutal occupation of the Mao's Communist China in 1949, with the help of Stalin. But as far as the movement is concerned, because of the ongoing daylight killing of the Uyghurs' aspiration and body and soul and dignity, more Uyghurs are inclined to go for separate, independent Uyghur state these days, which should be respected. Because
it's what's legitimate dissent.
But China finds this is very useful excuse, because when you advocate Uyghur rights around the world, any country has a diplomatic relationship with China cannot publicly support any separatist or secessionist movement. So the Chinese use this as a tool to silence some governments claiming that there is a organized separatist movement. So they distinguish the ultimate desire, the Uyghur people's desire versus what actually happening have to be distinguished.
So if this has been going on for a long, long time, why has it gotten so much worse in the last 10 years?
If you look through the Chinese history, us against them mentality have been very evident, as it has shown in the way that they treated the Tibetan people and in the way that they have treated non-Han Chinese individuals or subjects throughout the history. And also to the Chinese government's mindset, as they become bigger and more powerful, they need to also promote this oneness to others, like the Uyghurs and Tibetans. So you either become one of them or we will take you out. The only one logical, reasonable explanation is racism. The Chinese people have not realized, including those in power, that their language, their way of life, their culture, even religion are not something universal. As such, the others should not be forced to accept it. Because in the minds of the Chinese officials, if the Uyghurs are not transformed by force, as the Chinese ambassador in Washington shamelessly stated in the Western media, that the Uyghurs must be converted into normal human beings, eventually they become a political threat. So the diversity that the people in liberal societies cherish, admire, appreciate, had become something kept the Chinese officials awake at night.
Talk to me a little bit about the Trump administration response to this. How has it been, in your opinion?
United States government deserves a lot of credit, particularly members of Congress, Vice President Mike Pence, Secretary of State Pompeo, and Sam Brownback, who is leading the effort on religious freedom, deserve a lot of credit. But had they done enough? No. The response have been quite strong in the individual level, in the Congress and in administration, but it has not been collective to rectify, at least going after some of the human rights abusers who should be sanctioned under the Global Magnitsky Act, which is a very powerful tool that the United States government, along with several other Western democracies have.
For singling out individuals in the Chinese government for sanctions?
Yes, but the Treasury Department, Secretary Mnuchin, has not been fully on board on this effort.
I still can't help but note the irony, though, that an administration that called for the total shutdown of Muslims entering the United States, to quote them, and curtailing refugees into the United States, is now probably doing more about the Uyghur situation, at least vocally, compared to almost any Muslim nation on earth.
It makes sense to me because this is not about the Uyghurs anymore. The Chinese way of treating the Uyghurs, I think, woke up policy experts and government officials or people with influence, because this is going to become a part of problem worldwide. We already seen, according to the New York Times, more than a dozen countries adopting Chinese way of surveilling their own population, and even countries like New Zealand looking into the way that the Chinese police conducted itself. And we have seen what's happening in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong police actually gets help from Xinjiang police.
Yeah.
And also we've seen countries like Venezuela already adopted Chinese way of issuing identification card to even monitor who's voting, what not. And we're also seeing some Western countries, Poland, Hungary, Greece, looking to China's way of building state security apparatus.
I guess I'm just most surprised by the Muslim countries' reaction, right? The Prime Minister of Pakistan claimed not to have heard of the Uyghur crisis at all. Saudi Arabia, we mentioned earlier, has praised China for their treatment of the Uyghurs. And Egypt has actually deported Uyghurs back to China. Why is this happening from countries that should have real sympathy with the Uyghur population?
There are a few reasons. One, these societies are not free societies like ours in here or the Western Europe. The people don't have a voice. And then two, most of these Muslim countries have been criticized for their own human rights records. And they don't get criticism from China. So you scratch my back and I scratch yours type of mentality. So as long as the Chinese don't interfere, quote unquote, in domestic affairs of these Muslim countries, they also make a pledge not to interfere with the Chinese.
So at the end of the day, these are authoritarian countries that are bound more by their belief in governance than they are by their ethnicity or religion.
Right. And then the third, their silence have been bought out by Chinese money. And finally, there's an anti-West sentiment in some Muslim societies that have been utilized effectively by the Chinese. So they convince those Muslim leaders, look, they are not against, China is not against Muslims. We're against the Western government orchestrated so-called human rights concerns.
So I want to just talk briefly about the types of surveillance that goes on by the Chinese government against the Uyghur population. The surveillance is very high-tech, right? It enlists a lot of large corporations, and they require, for example, installing spyware on people's cell phones. What else do they do?
They have this mobile police station established, or set up on the streets. Every 100 yards that you go, you will be stopped or seen a mobile police station. They call it convenient police station. They are allowed to check your mobile phone. If you don't have this compulsory spyware they install. Before they force you to install, they check if there's any content that are banned in China, such as crescent star or certain sky blue color because it's the color of the Uyghur flag, verses from the Quran, or images of some individuals that the Chinese government does not like.
I've heard even not having a phone makes you suspicious.
Yes, and also based on Human Rights Watch report published recently, charging your phone too many times can be a reason.
What's wrong with that?
Because that means that you are using it too much, surfing the internet, communicating. Your electric bill, Human Rights Watch even stated that leaving the back door of your house, which is, these kind of things are perfectly legal, but the Chinese made it illegal for their own purposes. And also the other thing that they do, they are sending the Chinese cadres to the homes of the Uyghurs, as reported by University of Washington a lecturer, Darren Byler, that they send handpicked Chinese cadres to the Uyghur homes. Those homes could be somebody who has been taken in, their wife and children left behind, or just normal Uyghur family. So they go in and live with them. Basically, they eat on their dining table and sleep in their bedroom. We have images, we've seen images. And then the most jarring of this family homestay programs is to force the Uyghur kids to spy on their parents.
That's terrifying.
And the kids' honesty, based on disturbing reports that we have seen, resulted in some parents sending to the camp the next day. So it's been so intrusive. Recently, I attended a panel discussion. The title of the panel was "The Other Type of Prison," describing the Uyghurs who are not in the camps.
An open-air prison.
Open-air prison. So when you just imagine that you try to have a normal life, you take your children to school, you're stopped randomly by police, subject to biometric search, data collection, and the iris scan. In some instances, you're forced to give DNA sample if it was not done previously. And then when you kids off to school, the teachers force them to answer some private conversations, like what kind of conversation that you parents have at home. Do they practice? Do they teach you this and that? And the children's honest answer resulting in their parents' detention. And also the Uyghur kids have been forcibly taken into state-run orphanage. The Chinese government, based on their own reporting, will fully institutionalize their state-run orphanage by 100% at the end of next year, which is about 22% now. So there's a rapid increase of the construction of the orphanage, which was reported on BBC, CNN, and also the Vice News recently. They look like a prison, barbed wires and tall gates and cameras all around. So I think the legal scholars and policy experts are right when they said that the Chinese government is committing cultural genocide.
Nuri Turkal, thank you for joining us at Reason.
Thank you very much for having me.
For Reason, I'm Todd Cranen.